Hello, everyone. Sophie, you can unmute yourself. Start shortly.
Thank you very much. I was disabled there, so I shall leave my microphone on in that case.
Yeah.
On the floor.
Okay, now I'm also unmuted. So I guess I can start. Okay, welcome to this Era for Health webinar, From Promise to Responsibility, Pathways and Pitfalls to the Road to Responsible Health Innovation. As research and innovation funders, Era for Health has taken in responsible research and innovation, RRI for short, as approach and a core value and activity in the partnership. The RRI approach affects our governance model, our call procedures, and support activities towards proposal writers and funded projects. My name is Cecilia Mattison, Special Advisor at the Research Council of Norway and leading transversal activities and especially the RRI approach within the Era for Health. This webinar is a part of a series of Era for Health capacity building webinars and trainings that we have on many different topics. For RRI, guidelines for proposal writers and evaluators have been developed to support the initiation of the RRI approach in science. You find the guidelines on our web pages and they are integrated into our calls. But why is the RRI approach worth an additional effort, and what difference does it make when you start working together? This webinar is to inspire and engage you to use the RRI approach in a proposal and during the project. I now hand over to our RRI advisor, Sophie Stone, a research fellow at the University of Edinburgh in the UK. And to introduce today's main speaker, Sophie will also moderate questions at the end of this webinar.
Thank you very much, Cecilie. It's great to be here and a huge privilege to introduce our speaker today, a leading scholar in science and technology studies, Professor Ulrike Felt from the University of Vienna. And Professor Felt was originally trained as a theoretical physicist at the University of Vienna, receiving her PhD in 1983. She then spent 5 years working at CERN before shifting focus to studying the intersection between science, technology and society, returning to the University of Vienna, where she became a Professor of Science and Technology Studies, or STS as we call it, in 1999. And her career highlights would take me the full hour alone to share, but over a very distinguished career, she has held numerous leadership roles, including head of the STS department and dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences at Vienna, as well as an array of editorial and leadership roles in the wider STS field. And she has earned awards for developing and implementing Vienna's Master's Programme in Science Technology Society, as well as other initiatives, and still has found time to sit on numerous policy boards and groups, several of which have been key to the development of responsible research and innovation, or RRI. And throughout her career, most of her research has been interdisciplinary, involving close cooperation with natural sciences and medicine, and with interests spanning biomedicine, the environment, physics, and more recently digital transformations. She has written extensively on topics such as innovations and what they leave behind in society, knowledge production practices, governance and science in democratic societies, and much more. And this community might find her work on the social dimensions of obesity from about 10 years ago also particularly relevant. And critically for us, she also founded an interfaculty research platform that ran for just under 10 years, I think, studying responsible research and innovation in academic practice. And as such, we are extremely fortunate to have her here today to share some of her insights about RRI that I have no doubt will help us as a community better engage with responsible innovation and research moving forward. So thank you for joining us, Professor Felt, and the floor is all yours when you're ready.
Okay, thanks a lot for the introduction. I will try to share my slides. That should work, and now I just have to make them full screen. It works? Yeah. Okay, so thanks a lot for the introduction. It's a pleasure for me to be here and to share some of my experiences in this field. So I took the title From Promise to Responsibility, Pathways and Pitfalls on the Road to Responsible Health Innovation. Actually, we live in a moment when health innovation is propelled by strong visions. It's personalized medicine, seamless data flows, AI enabling diagnosis, more efficient healthcare systems. And these promises are powerful. They mobilize funding, shape policy agendas, but also inspire public and professional imagination. But such promises alone do not ensure that actually health improvements move towards the kinds, and all these things move towards the kinds of societies and health systems we value. And they need to be accompanied by practices, infrastructures, and governance arrangements that make responsible and inclusive futures possible. So today I want to trace a bit the journey from promise to responsibility, highlighting both the pathways that can support responsible health innovation and the pitfalls, or some of the pitfalls, that often remain hidden behind optimistic narratives. Before I turn to my main argument of the talk, let me briefly outline the background that shapes my perspective. Actually, over the past years, my work has been situated at the intersection of STS, so science and technology studies, and health research. I've been involved in a series of research projects that looked closely at informed consent processes, which have become really key in interacting with communities, in biobanking, as well as how digital transformations, particularly the expansion of health data infrastructures and the increasing use of AI, are reshaping practices, expectations, and responsibilities in healthcare. In all of these projects, we try to bring in some form of engagement and even co-creation activities. And from that stems my kind of input that I'm sharing. And this presentation actually then builds on these experiences, on the empirical work with patients, clinicians, researchers, policymakers, developers, on putting in place a co-creation process over a large in a large scale European health data initiative, and on analyzing how these promises of innovation kind of circulate, gain traction, and sometimes obscure the complexities we encounter. So in what I share today, that is not only studying the health innovations or the health improvements themselves or the research themselves, but above all the social, organizational, and political worlds in which they are imagined, contested, adapted, and finally also implemented. It is from this vantage point that I want to reflect on the pathways, and of course also some of the pitfalls, of responsible health research and innovation. And let me start by shortly situating the current developments in health innovation in the broader societal and political context, because that matters enormously, because we encounter other actors and they live in this kind of shared environment. Actually, across Europe, research and innovation have become tightly intertwined with ambitious digital health visions, highly mobile societies, rapidly aging populations, creating what is often not so nicely put as healthcare burdens, are positioned as key drivers behind the creation of the European health data space. The idea is to enable efficient exchange of and direct access to a wide variety of health data. So we want to combine electronic patient records, potentially genomic data, information from registries, and much more. And importantly, this is intended not only for clinical care, so the so-called primary use of data, but also for research, developing innovations, policy making, but also broader governance, so what we often refer to as secondary use. At the same time, and this is important to keep in mind, we live in societies where individualization has become very central, supported also by powerful discourses on precision and personalized medicine. It promises tailored, optimized solution for each citizen. But these promises come with a shift in responsibility. Individuals are increasingly expected to monitor themselves, to manage risk proactively, and to participate in maintaining their own health through data and observing data and acting along them. And crucially, citizens are also expected to contribute their data, thus be ready to play an active role in the health system. And all this illustrates how innovation, health data infrastructures, and societal expectations are developing together, and how notions of responsibility then become positioned in a new way, become a bit more distributed across institutions, researchers, technologies, and individuals. As I started already, I said promises are central to how health research and innovation is imagined and justified to do today, and therefore it's essential to reflect their role when thinking in terms of responsible research and innovation. We all write project proposals and we all promise. And therefore, I think it's essential to think what promises do, so how they act in the world. We are surrounded by powerful promises, as I said already, personalized medicine tailored to each individual body, AI breakthroughs that are supposed to revolutionize diagnostics, systems that promise faster, cheaper, and more efficient care, and the hope that preventive technologies will detect risks long before they become actually phenomena of illness. These are futures of, I quote, better, faster, and more efficient healthcare, visions that circulate widely in policy discourse, industry roadmaps, but also in research agendas. And in STS, so in science and technology studies, we often even speak of an economy of promise, so a market where promises compete against each other. So promises matter not because they try to give a clearer feeling for the future, but because they shape action in the present. They mobilize funding, attract political support, and create public legitimacy. They orient research trajectories, guide into investment decisions, and define an investment. I mean, not only money, but also time of researchers, which direction do they go, etc., and define what counts as desirable in innovation. But there is a shadow side, and I think it's important to not forget that. Strong promises can easily overshadow present uncertainties and risk perception. They can close down alternative pathways, making some futures hyper-visible and others all but thinkable. And they may, when broken too often, these promises also shake stable public trust relationships. Let me, even though you have all kinds of guides, let me just share for a moment how I understand responsible research and innovation. And this helps also to understand how I think in what follows about it. ROI is often presented in 4 interrelated dimensions, which many of you actually might already have come across or seen. I want to still briefly unpack them because they help us to see what responsibility could mean beyond compliance, regulatory compliance, or risk management. First, it's anticipation and reflection. This means for me pausing to ask, what kinds of health futures are we working towards? Who is supposed to benefit from them? And who might be left out? Whose values shape these visions and whose concern remain unheard? In other words, anticipation pushes us to look beyond the immediate promise of a technology and reflect on its broader societal impact. The second part, inclusiveness and diversity, points to the fact that responsible innovation, responsible research requires sensitivity to the diversity of values, needs, and interests. Health is experienced so profoundly differently across communities, and so innovation must remain open to multiple understanding of what counts as a benefit and what gains relevance. Inclusiveness is not just about inviting actors to the table and talking to them. It's about recognizing and valuing different ways of knowing and living. The third, transparency and openness, this concerns how knowledge is produced and shared. Are the processes of research and innovation accessible and understandable, at least in a broader manner, to societal actors? Are methods, data, and underlying assumption communicated openly within both research communities and policymakers, and where possible, also wider audiences? Openness is essential, in particular for trust building, but also for enabling meaningful participation from different kinds of actors. And the fourth part is responsiveness. Responsibility is not about having all the other answers from the start. It's about cultivating the ability to learn and adapt. Responsiveness means acknowledging limits that is always in any kind of research and the uncertainties, handling conflicts of interest openly, and being willing to adjust direction as new insights emerge and as we go. It is a developmental logic, one that leaves room for change. Taken together, these four dimensions remind us that responsibility is actually not a fixed box to tick. It is an ongoing practice, and this is particularly important in a field like health, where expectations run high, but uncertainties always remain substantial. So when we speak about ROI, participation is often highlighted as the central pillar. But what participation means in practice varies enormously within individual projects and across them. On paper, participation can sound straightforward. Involve stakeholders, listen to citizens, engage patients, consider diverse perspective. But in reality, participation sits on a spectrum, ranging from a more tokenistic consultation all the way to kind of genuine influence, allowing influence over decisions, trajectories, and priorities. And this raises, in my view, fundamental questions that any project would need to think about. Who is actually to be invited to participate? How are people asked to participate? So, participate in what? When in the innovation process are they engaged? And where does participation take place? And I would like to say a few words about each of that. Let's start by asking who is invited into the process and who remains absent, overlooked, or even actively excluded. Is participation imagined in a project limited to the usual suspect? And by that, I mean, for example, very often we engage with well-organized patient groups, or in digital projects, very often I encounter the more tech-savvy citizens or specific kinds of institutional stakeholders. And it's really important to think about, so who would be those that are left out from these, from having voice? Or do we manage to include those whose experiences are less visible, but most often affected? For example, people with chronic conditions, caregivers, marginalized communities, people with limited access, as in the case of digital tools. And for us, that was a real challenge when you want to develop, for example, a digital data platform for patients. It's not obvious how can you include people who have a very low level of digital literacy and still allow them to gain voice in such a process. Deciding who participates is a decision about whose perspectives matters, whose problems become visible, but also whose futures are taken seriously. The second key question is, how is participation organized? Is participation set up as a one-off consultation in the beginning? Or is it towards the end of the project as a kind of assessment? Or do we think about an ongoing dialogue? Are methods adapted to people's abilities, languages, and everyday realities? And it's important because very often as researchers, we expect something from people which they might not be able to deliver in these straightforward ways because they're not used to participate, they are not used to clearly voice what they would need, and it's important to find these kinds of translation mechanisms. And most importantly, and this is about how is power shared. In short, we can ensure that engagement is not symbolic, but actually shapes priorities, design choices, and decision-making. The how actually determines whether participation becomes tokenistic or whether it becomes a meaningful part of responsible innovation. And the image on the slide illustrates that participation varies enormously from minimal involvement, so information, towards genuine influence. Each step up requires more openness, more willingness to share authority, more recognition of the kinds of knowledge that different actors bring, but also, and I think this is often forgotten, much more time from all sides. A reality check in a world that runs on projects. Framing participation in this way helps us to ask not simply whether participation happens, but what kind of participation is possible and for whom. And it reminds us that moving from tokenism to meaningful involvement is by no means easy. It requires intentional design, institutional commitment in terms of resources and time, and a willingness to redistribute power in this process. Now, this directly connects to the question of how values are extremely important in these debates, are expressed in such processes, which I want to address before we move on to the where and the when. This question is so important as responsibility in health research is always at its core a matter of value expression. But values are not these kind of free-floating principles that we hold. They do not exist simply out there, waiting to be applied to a project. They are actually performed, expressed, and stabilized in specific social constellations. And that's what I try to show in this graphic. The slides should help to unpack that. At the top, we have the valuator. That's the person or the actor who expresses a value, whether it's a policymaker emphasizing efficiency, a clinician prioritizing specific kinds of safety, a company highlighting innovation, or a citizen advocating for privacy or for better information or for co-decision. And we need to ask who is speaking, in which role, from what position, with what authority. Then we have a valuee, that which is being valued. And very often, and I started in my project to think, okay, people value a platform, a health data platform. But actually I realized that they value specific aspects of something, and it's never the whole package. So this could be a technology or a doctor or a patient practice that they value, so how we do things, a specific way of data we collect, a risk, an algorithm, or even a societal aspiration. So we need to ask what exactly is being valued. So what is the value expressed towards? Which dimensions matter? Is it cost, accuracy, equity, trustworthiness, environmental impact, or whatever? And finally, there is always an audience when we express values. So the people and the groups to whom we want the value expression to be addressed. This might be a regulator, a researcher, a funder, a doctor, a patient, or any other wider publics. The audience matters because anything we utter, any utterance of values, only stick when they resonate with someone, when they gain traction. So together, these three elements, the valuator, the value, and the audience, they form what is called constellations of valuation. And these constellations shape which values surface or recede and which become authoritative in guiding health research and innovation. They are embedded in these valuation constellations are embeddable in possible roles that any evaluator can take. For example, we had people that at one point argue as an affected patient. Sometimes they speak in terms of as a taxpayer or as a person that cannot afford high-end medical treatment and thinks that any research is for others and not for them. And also infrastructures matter. For example, do people know the shared cultural narratives which they can use to support their value expression? And that's what I meant when I said language matters. So do we have access to express what we feel about? Why is that important? Because when we talk about responsible research, we often imply that there is a shared, stable set of values we simply must uphold. But in practice, I realized values are always plural, contested, and depend on the situation. So they are situational. They depend on who speaks, who listens, and what is at stake. And therefore, we cannot assume that they are stable. And we need to check on them throughout the process of developing both knowledge or innovations. Understanding valuations in this relational way helps us to see responsibility not as a kind of checklist, but as an ongoing negotiation of what and whom health research should ultimately serve. So let's go to the when and the where. Actually, participation takes place. When refers actually to the moment in the knowledge-making or innovation process when people are invited in. Are they included only at the end, once all the decisions are already made? Are patients consulted only when after the system is already designed? Or are they involved very early or early enough to shape problem framing? So what is the problem? Priorities or even developmental paths? The timing of participation determines whether the input can meaningfully influence outcomes or merely validate what is already found or decided. And the word, and that was very important, what I realized in my research, refers to the spaces and the settings in which participation occurs. Is participation happening in institutional environments like a clinical setting, a research lab, an advisory board, or a citizen group where certain norms dominate? For example, it's always interesting to observe when we bring citizens into a university environment that this, of course, frames the way what they express, or if we go more in a medical environment and what that does. Or does it take place in a more neutral, accessible space like community settings, platforms, or everyday care environments where different forms of knowledge can emerge and seem legitimate to be put forward? The setting shapes who feels able to speak, whose expertise counts, and which experiences can be made visible. So asking when and where participation takes place is not just a logistic question, it is a political one. Timing and setting determines whether participation opens up possibilities or simply reproduces existing power structures. And then from there comes the important point of trust that always comes to the surface when we speak about responsible research and innovation. But trust is chronically not simple. It is not something we can just add to a system or design into a technology or secure through a clever communication strategy. Trust is deeply relational. It is built over time, and that comes back to my argument, how important time is in such processes, through consistent practices, meaningful interactions, and institutional reliability. It is also unevenly distributed. Some actors patients or clinicians, policymakers, industry, they trust differently for different reasons and under different conditions. In the context of digital health and AI, for example, trust becomes even more complex. We are asked to trust systems we cannot fully see, algorithms we cannot fully meaningfully audit, data infrastructures that operate far beyond our everyday experience. And at the same time, institutions often hope that trust can be generated simply through transparency or information provision. But as STS research has shown for decades, trust is never produced by information alone. It is produced by relations, accountability forms, and responsiveness. And yet, and this is crucial, despite all these complexities, trust remains a prerequisite for any quality in health and healthcare development. Without trust, people will not share their concerns, their data. Clinicians might not adopt the most recent possibilities. Societies might not support the infrastructures needed for health care and innovation. So the challenge is not simply to create trust, but to create trustworthy practices and institutions. Practices that are stable, reflexive, inclusive, and open to be questioned. So let me give you an example. So we were invited to create a co-creation environment in a health data project. It was called Smart for Health. Let me now bring these questions of responsibility, situatedness, trust, and other elements in this concrete setting. What this project makes very clear is this: developing responsible digital health infrastructures is by no means a technical challenge, where some participatory elements have to find some space. It is fundamentally actually a social and cultural transformation. When we talk about co-creation, we are not simply inviting people to comment on a finished product. We are acknowledging that meaningful participation requires sensitivity to the context. So on the left side, you see cultural diversity, differences in language, variations in participatory cultures, and the specific characteristics of national healthcare systems. Of course, what is technologically available and how regulatory systems look like is as much important. And all that shapes what people can contribute, how they can participate, and what kinds of futures they imagine as desirable. Co-creation in that sense becomes a value and context-sensitive process, collaborative by design, but also evolving and experimental. It requires an openness to uncertainty and to bring being changed, and by what we learn from citizens, professionals, and other stakeholders. And when co-creation works well, it orients innovation towards outcomes that align strongly with some of the principles of responsible research and innovation. It supports caring because it enables technology to address diverse needs and concerns rather than assuming a universal user. It fosters sustainability. And by that, I do not only mean technical and financially, but also socially and institutionally. It can be empowering because people see their concerns reflected in the very infrastructure they build. And finally, it makes systems adaptable, helping them to respond to cultural differences, emerging disruptions, and the realities of everyday life. This example shows that co-creation can never be a decorative add-on. It is a practical pathway towards responsibility. And importantly, it shifts innovation away from a purely or mainly promise-driven logic towards a more kind of situated, relational, and accountable practice. All that, of course, is embedded in funding and innovation environment, to which I will say a few words in a minute. So when we talk about ROI, it is actually tempting to treat it as a checklist. We say anticipate, yes, did. We include, yes, we are transparent, we are responsive. But in practice, actually, ROI is not a universal recipe that can be applied everywhere, anywhere. It is context sensitive, and it's a process which I had to learn the hard way, full of friction and unconsidered misalignments. What counts as responsible innovation in healthcare actually depends profoundly on where we are, who is involved, and what histories, infrastructures, and cultural expectations shape the field. Different health systems have totally different vulnerabilities. Different communities have different understandings of what care is, what good care is, who should be trusted, and what participation means. And different regulatory frames open up or constrain what kinds of innovations are easily possible and where there are many hurdles that have to be overcome. So in practice, any co-creation or participatory approach is also already pre-framed, for example, by funding calls, by project formats, and by predefined deliverables. And this is particularly true when you get to these big supranational projects as they are funded by the European Union. It is fascinating to see how difficult it is, even though it is scripted into a project application, to turn that into a lived reality. So the idea of starting from an open field is a fiction. We always already enter a landscape that has been to a certain degree scripted in advance, and it's important to make that clear from the beginning. In my research, for example, I encountered a deep misalignment between the temporalities of the researchers, the technological developers, the software developers, and our own work with citizens and users. There were also different ideas about which value is to be prioritized over others, or to balance between investment and return for different actors. And I think this is really important to be very outspoken about the limits and the possibilities in these processes. This is part of a responsibility. This means ROI cannot be reduced to a single workshop, a single ethics review, or a single moment of engagement. It's always a process, unfolding over time, through rhythms of interaction, through small and big moments that reorient the direction of a project. It is an investment in time and energy that any alignment of different expectation, values, and visions needs. And I think very often this kind of time and energy budget, if you want to call it like that, is something which runs low notoriously. To do ROI well, we must need sensitivity to these temporal investments involved. The time researchers can give, the time citizens or patients can realistically contribute, and the time needed to build trust, alignment, and shared understanding. ROI unfolds in these temporalities and not outside of them. This means responsibility is not something we declare, it is something we produce together with those that cohabitate the environment in which research, knowledge, innovation unfolds. In this sense, ROI is less a framework and more an ongoing, situated practice. It requires staying attentive to complexity, to uncertainty, and to the plurality of the worlds and the futures that health innovations and health research touches on. And this is a kind of interesting contradiction because research and innovation very often thinks of in quite universalistic terms. And actually, when these innovations arrive in the real world, they have to become situated. So to conclude, as we draw this talk to a close, I want to highlight a broader transformation in how we think about responsibility in health-related research and innovation. For a long time, responsibility has been understood primarily In the beginning, something needs to be assessed. The focus has often been on managing risk, preventing harm, ensuring compliance, determining liability, an approach that implicitly assumes stable systems and predictable consequences. Yet the world in which today's health innovations unfold are anything but stable. They're dynamic, uncertain, and deeply interconnected. Digital infrastructures, for example, evolve rapidly. Patient pathways diversify. Societal expectations shift. In such conditions, the limits of a compliance-driven responsibility becomes increasingly clear. So this is where a different logic of responsibility comes into view. One that is more practice-oriented, as I already said, accompanying developments. Rather than asking on how to avoid harm, which of course we have to do, but not only stick to that, it asks how to cultivate capacities, listening for listening, adapting, and caring throughout the process in which we produce knowledge and innovation. It shifts our attention from accountability alone to what Donna Haraway has so nicely called responsibility, the ongoing ability to notice what matters, to stay open to changing conditions, and to respond thoughtfully to the needs and concerns of different actors. Cultivating responsibility means fostering our collective capacity to listen, to adapt, and to respond meaningfully to concerns, needs, and values of those who will live with the outcomes of innovation. Seen in this way, responsibility is obviously not a checkpoint in the beginning or at the end of a project. It is something that develops gradually within relationships through iterative engagement with patients, professionals, communities, environments, depending on what research is to be done. It is less about predicting the future and more about staying attuned to the many possible futures and adjusting course as they unfold. This shift marks an important step for responsible health innovation. It invites us to design practices, collaborations, and institutions that do not merely safeguard against failure, but actively support the emergence of more inclusive, caring, and context-sensitive forms of innovation. I've tried not to give a one-size-fits-all approach, but much rather underline the kind of context-specific questions that need to be asked and addressed when wanting to implement ROI into research and innovation practice. So the question I leave you with is, how might we build systems that foster not only responsibility, but actually responsibility? So systems capable of learning, adapting, and staying accountable to diverse worlds they affect. Because ultimately, I think the quality and legitimacy of our health futures depends on how we respond to that challenge. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Felt. I hope everybody can hear me. I'm not sure if anybody can see me, but that was a wonderful and thoughtful and engaging talk. So thank you for sharing that as both an introduction to RRI and thinking of it as a situated and ongoing practice. And if this were an STS field talk, I would have many questions personally, especially around the misalignment between the temporalities of everyone involved and foregrounding this as part of pursuing responsibility. However, I would like to now open up the floor for the next, I think we have about 15 minutes or so to hear from our audience, as I'm sure our audience have questions. So the way this is going to work is, I believe the chat should now be open. I hope, yes, the chat is now open, thank you. So if anybody has any questions that they'd like to put them in there, and I shall do my best to moderate. So thank you very much. We will keep an eye on the questions coming in, Ulrike, if that's all right. whilst we wait, I would just like to remind everybody that recording is still on, I believe. So just to be mindful of that.
But maybe while we wait for people formulating questions, your question about the time alignments is actually
Yes.
turned out to be one of the most important parts of hurdles, because every system has very different kind of allocation of time and splitting of time. And it was very interesting for us to see it was not a problem to write the deliverables, but they were often at the wrong moment in time. And so it was fascinating for me as somebody who analyzes these things to have to do them and to analyze them. And it was very interesting to kind of hit these time walls, actually virtually a long 4 years of collaboration. And that was really interesting to learn.
I bet. I mean, recently I've got very interested in, I think it was Christina Curdy's idea of the synchrony mirage, and the sort of, as you say, this misalignment. And it makes it very challenging to not only know what to do, but when to do it and when to repeat it because obviously the innovation system is not linear, and it's knowing how to revisit and when to revisit, and being very reflexive to that. It's a fascinating space. We do have a question from the chat. I do forgive my pronunciation of names, but from Ava. Hello everyone, I have and worked within the LV process and the various documents to be used in multi-centered localizations and cognitive debriefing. What will the future look like here? Today the focus is on getting closer and earlier contact with patients, but where do the linguists enter the process? Will it continue to be at the consultant level as today, and how do you present your interests? So there are a few questions there. Do you need me to break some of those down, Ulrike? Would that be helpful?
I mean, this is a huge question, actually,
Yes.
because I would need to know much more about the exact process, because that's exactly one of the points I was making. It is extremely difficult for when you enter a new kind of health situation where research goes on or where innovation goes on, to actually empirically find out where is an ideal moment of intervention, but also who is the intervenant. So who is the best person to kind of point to define the points of intervention. And I do think that is something across the different fields. So I do not know enough to be able to answer that in a, how to say, in an honest way. But I think across all the projects I found it fascinating to think about. For example, we see even across countries differences when we ask people to donate, for example, blood or tissue or so for research. So biobanking. And when you go from one country to the other, it is not allowed to ask people in specific situations or to speak to them about donation in specific situation. So in Finland, for example, when you come to the emergencies, you're not allowed to ask people whether they are ready to do something else. Because so it's a real, the question is, the when is a really important question. I'm really sorry, but I will not be able to answer this specific question in how to say, in a well-informed way, let me call it like that.
That's super. Ava, if you'd like to add any more specific detail or specific questions, please.
Yes, maybe
feel free to
if I
do
know
so.
more, then I can be useful.
Oh, I mean, it was a great response anyway. Thank you. Well, whilst we're giving Ava the opportunity to perhaps revisit or not, we have another question from Ilza, who says, from my experience, context is of great importance. In Latvia, for example, the gardening season influences the desire to engage in research during the summer season. Do you have any recommendations for planning time for public involvement?
Yeah, what I realized, and that's what I meant with these temporal alignments, because the project started 1 month, in 1 month. Let's say it starts in March. And then you have, because we all work in projects, that's the next point, I think. We don't have this kind of, let's do the process whenever it is good, but we start with funding cycles. So the funding cycle starts the process. And so sometimes it's just very complex to align these things. And I can tell this particular story in the Smart for Health project. We fell into COVID. And with COVID, you had these waves where you could not engage with people directly, and the waves were the moments where you could. And so it was a very specific kind of encounter that people talked to each other when they came to discuss certain aspects with us together and to work together. So it was so obvious for me that this timing became such a difficulty to see that. And so when you in your research see that, so you would have to think about first, who are the groups that I want to get? And what are the life situation of these groups? So it is always difficult to think, do I go for evening meetings for certain engagements? Do people have the affordance of spending a full day on certain topics? Because they would need to be able to get out of work and other things. When you go to the weekend, you have again those who have family obligations, etc. So this is really a design thing where we have to carefully craft when it is possible. And even if in one of the projects, it was about engaging with the medical professionals in the hospitals, bringing AI to the hospital. And there it was also interesting that, of course, you need to know the work rituals. Exactly how can I kind of fiddle in a long enough break, sitting down and co-thinking about the reality of work. So you're totally right, but in that sense, it would need actually, when the project starts, to revisit the timeline of the project. And I think this is often the problem when you have fixed all deliverables already and you say, oh, in month 3, I will do that. And month 3 is just the wrongest moment in time when you want to do something. Try to get people to participate in anything just in the pre-Christmas time. This would just be the wrongest of all wrong moments when you think you don't want to sit down and talk about kind of some health topic, except you are directly affected by it. But if it's something broader. So yes, you need to, and actors might have different rhythms, and to synchronize that is another challenge. So if you need, let's say, some developers, and I needed software engineers and developers, and I needed the researchers, and I needed citizens, and then try to align that, that is a particular kind of challenge too. But it just needs, I realized it needs much more co-planning and rethinking the whole project rhythm. And to be honest, immediately to the funding bodies and say, okay, given that we start in March, we will need to reconsider certain kinds of timings.
Thank you. And Lawrence in the chat has said that the points discussed here relate very much to user-centered design, iteratively, when developing healthcare innovations.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. But, you know, user-centered design has this idea that there is this clear use relationship. In research more generally, you cannot so easily think about what is the use context of a knowledge, or what is, you know, involvements look really very differently. If you think like I had what a platform, or if it was more about healthcare research environments, that matters. It's very different. It's very, very different, because you don't have this ideal relationship. And for the user design, it's very interesting. How much space do you give to, and about how do you think about different non-users? So how do they get space? Very often, it was very funny because in one of my projects, which was not on health, but on participation in city design, it was very interesting that it was about digitalization, and then the participation was digital. And of course, everybody who is non-digital is automatically excluded. And so sometimes these things happen that we do not reflect that our processes kind of exclude exactly the people that we should kind of get in and get to participate.
Thank you. That's a vital point as well. We have another question from Lena, who has said responsibility requires a certain confidence. For example, going into a meeting with an open mind and with open questions instead of a fixed agenda, fixed options, or fixed opinions. In this way, I think ego can stand in the way of co-creation. Do you have any insights into how that can be navigated? For example, methods which may offer researchers a sense of security, even while being responsible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think that it's good to have a structure when I go into a meeting, but not the structure that I usually have that I can then tick box it, but I have more a task-oriented structure so that we need to find an agreement to a specific kind of task and not so much to have an outcome-oriented. And that is helpful because it structures and at the same time it's not closed. So it's really thinking about planning without fixing. And I think that's a bit I think structuring is very important in the sense that otherwise you very often get into looping and you stay. So I think defining some kind of guidelines, or guidelines is the wrong word, defining some kinds of intermediary points where you can say, okay, now we need to continue. And that's why, for example, I have very often a set of questions which I want to go through. So as I said, I want to look at the who, I want to look at the when, how, the when, and the where. And so to think, let me start with the who, and the who defines then what do we need to do with the rest of it. Because maybe certain kinds of participation will not work with certain communities. And we once had maybe I can share that we once, way back, had a project that was on how citizens deal with technological health possibilities. Like it was a comparison between genetic testing and organ transplantation in different European countries. It was a European project. And there were religious studies people on board who thought that it was important to also look at religious values. And then we had made a design on how to run the focus groups and everything. And then we realized that we just did not get the diversity of religious groups. And in my despair as a researcher, because I went to all the communities in the city, spoke to them, asked them to distribute, and they promised support and everything. It didn't work out really. It was very low diversity from religious backgrounds. And then I went to the general hospital because there they have a caretaker for all the different religions when people are in the hospital and they need religious support. And then I learned a lot about why our method totally failed and why certain groups will never sit down in a setting that we had suggested to discuss sensitive issues like that in diverse groups. So I had to learn it the hard way, or we had to learn it the hard way, I would have to say, that we did think religious is just like age or education, another parameter in our diversity imagination. And so I think we need also to think about our methodological approaches to integration, to adapt that maybe situatedness and to break out of this idea that a method is fixed and it has to be the same everywhere. And that's comparison, for example. No, it is not. That's what I learned.
Thank you. And I think there's a certain humility to being able to recognize what we don't know and learn accordingly. So I think,
and I have realized that even though you spend a lot of time on thinking about these things, you still are hit by reality when you go to the field.
Absolutely. I'm very conscious of time. We have one more question come in, and then I think I'll defer to Cecily to see whether that is indeed time. But from Tamas, we have a question about how much do you think ecological values and sustainability are currently integrated into RRI?
You're speaking about a topic that is very close to my heart. My current project works exactly on questions of how much the technologies we think that solve all our problems are creating new kinds. I think in particular, when you think about the data expansion that we're living, this is a kind of real challenge to the ecological question. And so ecological questions should come in on many different levels, and they do not yet do that sufficiently. I'm trying to introduce them when I do things sometimes a bit in the soft way, in a sense like listening if that comes up, if that's a concern. But in the digital health project, I realized that this is not at all a concern, but it should be one. And I do think that is something that drives my research right now, not only on the health sector, but more because the digital is imagined to solve all our problems. And I think it elegantly creates new ones, be it in the resources, the energy supply, the change in the social relations we have, etc., which we need to think very carefully about. And in health, it's about what data do to the imagination of people, if they are healthy or not. And you mentioned in the beginning my obesity research, and that was very interesting for me, how much data matter if people find that their body is the way they should be or not. And I think we also create certain kinds of normative ideals, and the self-observation is not always a helpful tool for people to actually realize a state where they feel healthy and not just are supposed to become healthy.
Thank you very much. And I believe that is probably all we have time for. So please can everybody again thank me in joining you, Professor Felt, for your time, your interest and your wonderful talk. So thank you ever so much for joining us today. And I shall hand back to Cecily to finish up. Thank you.
Yes, this was just wonderful, Ulrike and everybody. And thank you all for listening. And it will be available on YouTube too, for everybody to come back to if they want to listen again, or new listeners. So thank you, Ulrike, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, and happy holidays, everybody.
Yep, to everybody.
Happy holidays.
Bye.